Hello, my name is Tessa Asquith-Lamb and I'm one of the artists who works on the Gallery Social programme at the National Galleries of Scotland. In the second of my videos today, I'm going to be looking at an art activity we can have a go at based on Viviane Sassen's beautiful photograph In Bloom. In this photograph, a figure stands in an amazing blue and yellow frothy dress in a field of pink tulips. The dress is floating up into the air and the figure resembles a flower. We're going to try and encapsulate some of those ideas in our activity today. So I'll just run through the materials first. I've got some watercolour paper, I've got a white candle, some watercolour paints, and I've got my brush and my water pot, and I've also got some kitchen salt. So to start today, we're going to think about the shapes and the colours that are in that Viviane Sassen photograph. In my mind, I just see the kind of the yellow and the blue and that froth of that flower, and that's what I'm going to try and bring into my piece here today. This is the kind of watercolour pad that's already gummed around the edges, which is good because it holds it flat as it dries, but you might want to tape down your paper. Take your candle and think about the shapes of a petal and draw onto your watercolour paper kind of crinkly edge like this. Now the thing about this is that you're literally working blind. You've no idea really where you're drawing. I'm just going to rub that over a few times like this. Can't see anything. It's a bit like a sort of secret message. And then I'm going to get my wet brush and I'm going to put it into this dark blue paint. I'm going to rub it quite a few times across the surface until I've got quite a lot of paint on my brush. And then I'm going to drag this over the surface of where I think I put the candle wax. And can you see what's happening? We've got this lovely lines coming through where the wax is resisting the paint. It's kind of magic. I like it. The next step is to wet this area in between. This is a very experimental technique and it's just really about playing with the paints and playing with the colours and seeing where it takes you. So I've wet that whole area inside that kind of swooshing shape, and I'm thinking about the other colour that's in that photograph, which is the really beautiful golden yellow. It's the kind of yellow that reminds me of primroses, the sulphury yellow that you get of primroses as they appear in the spring. So I'm going to use some yellow here, get quite a lot of yellow on my brush, and I'm going, instead of doing lines this time, I'm going to let dabs of that yellow fall onto the already wet surface. And as they fall onto the wet surface, the pigment and the colour expands out into these shapes, into these flower-like shapes. I'm going to move on to using some other paints here. These are really beautiful, kind of iridescent, shiny, almost metallic paints. And there's a good gold in there that I thought I'd try. Let's add some of that in there. I like that. This is a kind of lemony, pale gold. I'm going to add the pale gold in amongst those colours. Where it hits the blue, of course, I'm getting a green. And then I've got, this is a kind of lemony yellow. I'm going to add that in. Lemony golden yellow. It's really beautiful to watch them change. You could add more water on top as well. Just flick the water on and then add a little bit more paint and just see what happens when you get those shapes. I'm going to try and show you without getting wet paint everywhere. There we go. So everything's pretty wet there on that paper just now. And that's what I want it to be for the next stage. And I'm just going to make sure everything's wet by just putting a bit more water on my blue. So the next part of this experimental technique we're going to try today is to get the salt. Now this is just the kind of cooking salt that you'd have in the kitchen, and I'm going to sprinkle a little bit onto that surface. Where it hits the wet paint, you get this amazing granular surface of little speckles, a bit like kind of sandy surface. I'll show you that. See the speckly surface there. Now, of course, I'm having to hold this very flat at the moment because everything's very wet. But as that dries, those speckles will stay there. And once it's completely dry, you can put it over the bin and just rub it quite gently with your hand. And the salt will fly off and you're left with all these little lovely granular surfaces. So that in itself is really quite a beautiful thing. And you can see some other examples here that I've been playing around with. These don't use the candle really very much. They're just mostly watching the way that the paint expands over the surface. I've got a lovely peachy golden experiment here, and I've torn the edges of some of them just to sort of get some nice shapes. So I'm going to let this one dry, and I'll show you another thing that you can do with these. So this is a previous example, and I've dusted off some of the salt. You can still kind of feel the salty surface a little bit. And I'm going to rip this. I'm going to sort of tear around the edge of it, thinking about the idea of skirts sort of flying up in the air and the shape that they might make. And I'm going to see, I'm making like looks a bit like a seashell, doesn't it, like this? And I really like the edges that you get on torn paper. They have this lovely softness to them that you don't get with cut paper. And it's nice to contrast that with a cut edge. So these are a couple of different ones that I've made here like this. And thinking about the dancer-like model in the photograph, what I've done here is I've cut out some legs and arms and a head, and I've stuck them down onto another one of my experimental watercolour pictures like this. And you can see that she's kind of emerging from this cloud of blue ink. And I'm going to take one of these torn pieces like this, and I'm going to move it around like this over the surface until I like the way it looks, until it reminds me of that skirt kind of flying up in the air. I think it's about there. And then I'm going to stick that down onto the surface. And there we've got my inspired by In Bloom by Viviane Sassen watercolour picture, inspired by the flowers and the colours of spring.